This is the first time in modern political history that the palace has had to announce the separation of the heir to the throne. But both the Prince and Princess of Wales went ahead with their engagements today.
How can two people stand side by side in nearly every photo, yet be shown so differently? For years, images of Prince Charles and Princess Diana painted a picture of elegance, unity, and tradition. But what if those very photos were part of a quiet manipulation, designed not to reflect reality, but to reinforce an illusion? How were these images staged to exaggerate Charles's authority? Why was Diana, despite being equally tall, always made to look smaller, physically and symbolically? And how did she eventually turn that same lens into her own weapon of truth? Let's get into details. Every image of Prince Charles and Princess Diana captured during their marriage appeared to tell a story of elegance, tradition, and stability. At face value, these photographs became symbols of a seemingly perfect royal couple, the heir to the British throne and his beautiful young bride. Whether they were attending official ceremonies, walking through palace gardens, or posing for magazine covers, the visual narrative was consistent. Charles looked dignified, protective, and slightly taller, while Diana appeared demure, graceful, and always a step behind, both figuratively and sometimes literally. But beneath the polished frames lay a subtle and carefully constructed lie that very few noticed at the time. From the early 1980s, official royal photography followed certain unspoken rules. These rules weren't just about lighting or wardrobe, they were about status. Prince Charles and Princess Diana were, in reality, roughly the same height, both standing at approximately 5 feet 10 inches. However, that equality never translated to the photographs shared with the world. In every staged image, Charles was made to look visibly taller. This wasn't a coincidence. Photographers and royal aides made specific choices to maintain that illusion. Diana was often asked to position herself slightly below Charles by standing on a lower step, tilting her posture, or placing one foot forward, which made her appear shorter in height. Heels? Those were managed too. She rarely wore anything with more than 2 centimeters of lift, just in case it might compromise the visual balance that palace insiders were keen to preserve. This visual manipulation served a greater purpose, to symbolically reinforce the traditional dynamic of the royal family. Charles, as the heir, needed to appear not just physically dominant, but also emotionally and socially elevated. Diana, despite her own noble lineage and public charisma, was presented as secondary, an elegant support to the man destined to be king. While this might seem like a minor photographic detail, it fed into a much larger narrative that had real implications on how the public perceived their marriage. And for years, it worked. In the early days, particularly around their engagement in 1981 and the royal wedding that followed, the public was brought into the fairy tale. Millions tuned in to watch Diana walk down the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral in her voluminous ivory silk gown. The moment was globally broadcast, drawing in over 750 million viewers across more than 70 countries. The image of Charles and Diana standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, waving to the crowds as husband and wife, became iconic. But that image, like many that followed, was carefully crafted. Diana's body language was softened. Charles stood upright, shoulders square, even the royal figurehead. And yet, even in that early photograph, if one looked closely, the distance between them was more than just symbolic. As the years passed, the visual strategy only became more deliberate. In group photos, Charles was often placed at the center, Diana to the side. In public appearances, she was asked to stand slightly behind or angle her body subtly toward him. These positioning tactics were part of a broader palace-driven effort to maintain the hierarchy within the family, especially as Diana's popularity soared. What no one could have foreseen in those first few years was just how quickly Diana would outshine Charles in the eyes of the public, and how that shift would unsettle the institution behind the imagery. By the mid-1980s, Diana's charm, openness, and genuine compassion made her a global sensation. She wasn't just admired for her looks, she was loved for her warmth. Her visits to hospitals, her embrace of children with disabilities, and her decision to walk through landmine zones and shake hands with AIDS patients without gloves sent a powerful message. And while the public gravitated toward this authenticity, it also posed a quiet threat to the established image of the monarchy. Within the palace, the careful control over Diana's appearance became even more intense. There was a growing concern that her presence would eclipse Charles's, and in many ways it did. The visual hierarchy persisted. Whether attending a formal dinner or standing before the press after a foreign tour, Diana remained in frames that implied she was in support, not in command. Even when she began taking solo engagements or working independently on her causes, efforts were still made to manage how she appeared in photos connected to Charles. Palace staff were careful to position her where she wouldn't visually overwhelm him, especially when standing side by side during official events. But for Diana, the pressure went beyond physical positioning. She was becoming increasingly aware that her role in these photos wasn't about capturing a moment of love or equality. It was about maintaining an illusion. The fairy tale was crumbling privately, but in front of the camera, she was expected to continue performing. Her mental health began to suffer under the weight of this public persona. She spoke years later of feeling isolated, misunderstood, and boxed in, her real emotions hidden behind carefully orchestrated smiles. Still, she played her part, at least for a while. As her marriage began to deteriorate behind the palace walls, the images of the couple became more strained. Observers started picking up on the tension in their body language. The smiles became tighter. Their glances rarely met. The physical closeness faded. Yet the height manipulation continued, and the effort to maintain a harmonious visual remained until it simply could not. By the early 1990s, Diana was no longer willing to pretend. She began choosing her own engagements, coordinating her own public appearances, and making decisions about how she would be photographed. She understood the power of the lens, and she no longer allowed it to be used solely to serve someone else's story. That marked the beginning of a shift not just in her personal identity, but in how she engaged with the public on her own terms. And that quiet rebellion would only grow stronger with time. The more Diana tried to navigate her royal responsibilities, the more she found herself confined by the very image that had once made her beloved. Her growing popularity across the United Kingdom and around the world did not ease the pressure. It made it worse. The monarchy had never encountered someone like her, a royal figure with genuine emotional depth, magnetic presence, and a direct connection with ordinary people. And instead of celebrating that, the institution became increasingly wary. This shift became especially visible in public engagements. While Charles represented tradition and duty, Diana embodied a softer, more human side of royalty. She wasn't just waving from a balcony or attending banquets. She was sitting at the bedside of AIDS patients when much of the world was still gripped by fear and misinformation. She visited minefields in Angola, met with leprosy patients in Nepal, and hugged children living with disabilities. But even then, her image had to be managed. Royal press teams carefully reviewed her photo opportunities, attempting to ensure that her humanitarian appeal didn't overpower the family's collective image. In joint appearances with Charles, her position, angle, and distance were still subtly controlled. Palace insiders began to feel the tension. Diana was no longer just a supporting figure. She was becoming the center of attention. Charles, who had long believed his future role as king would naturally make him the most admired royal, was finding himself in the shadow of his wife. The strain on their marriage, already deepened by personal incompatibilities and infidelities, now played out subtly in front of cameras. Public events grew more awkward. Photographers who had once framed the couple in tight, affectionate poses now had to work harder to find shots that didn't reveal the emotional distance between them. By the late 1980s, Diana's expressions had changed. The effortless smile that once defined her royal appearances became more practiced. In some photos, she looked distracted. In others, she seemed distant. But the media machine continued to churn. Headlines still called them the storybook couple. Tabloids speculated about everything from their parenting style to the color of Diana's gowns. Yet very few noticed the quiet evolution happening within the photos themselves. One subtle but recurring theme became harder to ignore. In joint portraits or formal photographs, Diana's posture often reflected discomfort. Her shoulders were slightly hunched. Her gaze didn't always meet Charles's. She began placing her hands in protective positions, folded in front of her, clutched around a clutch purse, or resting defensively against her waist. These weren't accidental. Body language experts have since pointed out that Diana's positioning in photos during this period often revealed a need for personal space and emotional shielding. Still, the images had to be released. The royal household had long used photography as a means of shaping public opinion, and now that opinion was more divided than ever. Charles continued to appear composed and regal, but Diana's visible discomfort challenged the image of unity. Her emotional transparency was becoming a liability within the firm and a lifeline to the public. When their formal separation was announced in 1992, the official photos became even more strained. Though still married on paper, their joint appearances were fewer and far more calculated. Each moment in front of the camera was dissected, often revealing the growing gap between perception and reality. During one state visit, Diana was captured looking away as Charles engaged with foreign dignitaries. At another event, they stood meters apart on a palace balcony, their smiles faint, their bodies tense. But behind the scenes, Diana was already taking steps to redefine her public presence. Freed from some of the protocol that had constrained her, she began working more independently. She chose photographers who understood her style and personality. One of the most notable collaborations was with Mario Testino, whose photos of Diana just before her death became some of the most iconic royal portraits ever taken. In those images, the difference is immediately clear. Diana appears confident, relaxed, even playful, no longer adjusting herself to accommodate someone else's frame. She also became more selective with the kinds of appearances she made. Instead of attending events as a pair, Diana opted for solo engagements that reflected her interests: mental health, homelessness, palliative care, landmine victims. The images from these visits show a woman in control of her message, often interacting directly with people without any of the stiffness that had defined her earlier public life. Gone were the carefully staged scenes where she stood behind her husband. Now, the focus was on what mattered to her. That autonomy was not just personal, it was political. In a family where hierarchy and control are paramount, Diana's ability to speak through the camera lens without saying a word was revolutionary. She used image not to reinforce her status, but to connect with real people, real stories, and real suffering. And in doing so, she challenged the very structure that once tried to silence her voice with stage-managed photos and orchestrated public moments. In the years between her separation and divorce, this transformation became even more pronounced. While Charles's public image remained tethered to tradition, Diana's evolved into something much more modern. She wore simpler clothes, moved with less entourage, and frequently ditched stiff formalities. Her presence felt real, lived in, and human. Photographers noted that she stopped asking for perfect angles. She welcomed more natural light, genuine moments, and spontaneous expressions. It was no longer about how the camera saw her, but how she wanted the world to see the causes she cared about. Even when she was surrounded by photographers, Diana often made the people around her the center of the image. Whether it was an ill child in a hospital or a survivor of violence, her eye contact, body language, and attentiveness became the real focal point. These were not the poses of someone trying to reclaim power through image alone. They were the actions of a woman who had finally found freedom in being herself. What had once been a performance turned into authenticity, and that shift was captured not through speeches or press releases, but through photographs that required no caption. Diana had learned the rules of royal image-making and then quietly rewrote them. What started as an attempt to make her smaller than Charles turned into something far more powerful. She made herself seen, on her own terms. By the time Diana's divorce from Prince Charles was formally announced in August 1996, the illusion of their marriage had fully collapsed. The photographs that once told the tale of a royal fairy tale were now seen in a different light. What had seemed like a loving partnership now appeared carefully scripted. Images from past years were revisited by the media and public alike, this time not with admiration, but with critical eyes. people began to notice just how often Diana had been positioned in the background, adjusted for appearance, and subtly diminished in visual hierarchy to keep Charles in the dominant frame. That year, the shift was not only emotional and institutional, it was visual. Diana was no longer part of the royal framework, yet her public image had never been more powerful. She had found her footing, and with it, an understanding of how to use the very tool that once controlled her, the camera. Her collaborations with media, especially photographers like Mario Testino, now centered on truth and personality rather than pageantry and protocol. Those final photos taken in the months before her passing showed a woman reborn. Diana appeared poised and relaxed, without the overly formal wardrobe or guarded body language that had once defined her royal years. In one of the most iconic images from the Vanity Fair shoot, she sat slightly leaned forward, making direct eye contact with the camera. There was no throne, no formal setting, just Diana. That choice of presentation said more than a royal decree ever could. It was her reclaiming her story without needing a single caption. During this period, she also became more vocal about the realities of her life inside the monarchy. In her now infamous 1995 interview with the BBC's Panorama program, Diana openly spoke about her struggles with mental health, feelings of isolation, and the overwhelming pressure of maintaining an image that didn't reflect her reality. She revealed how she felt used by the institution and described moments when she was overwhelmed by expectations placed upon her simply because she had become a public figure. The interview shocked the establishment, but for millions of viewers, it validated everything they had suspected from those carefully posed photographs over the years. That candid conversation marked a turning point. It reminded the world that behind the grand halls and palace gates was a woman navigating loneliness, duty, and the contradictions of public adoration. When Diana admitted that there were 3 of us in this marriage, it wasn't just a revelation about infidelity. It was a broader statement about how her identity had been split, manipulated, and diminished to fit an image crafted by others. For so long, the photos had tried to tell one story. Now, her voice was correcting the record. In the year that followed the Panorama interview, Diana's solo work intensified. Her presence at events was deliberate and deeply personal. She focused on causes often considered controversial or too sensitive: landmines, AIDS awareness, mental health, because she no longer needed approval to show who she was. Images from this era captured her looking engaged, sometimes emotional, but always sincere. She leaned into conversations, held hands with the vulnerable, and connected without hesitation. These were not press opportunities. They were real moments of empathy. Importantly, the media also began to shift in tone. For much of the 80s and early 90s, Diana was simultaneously idolized and scrutinized. Tabloids obsessed over her appearance, speculated about her emotions, and often played into royal messaging. But post-separation, the tone began to mature. Diana had stepped outside the royal script, and in doing so, demanded to be seen not as a princess, but as a person. The public respected that. And for once, so did the cameras. Yet, even with her growing independence, Diana was never fully free of the media's lens. Paparazzi still followed her every move, often aggressively. The same attention that had built her image now threatened her peace. In many ways, Diana had mastered public image making, but she couldn't control how others chose to invade her life. And tragically, it was that relentless pursuit of photographs that would play a role in her final hours. On the 31st of August in 1997, Diana died following a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. She was being pursued by paparazzi at the time. The irony was devastating. For years, images had shaped her world. In the end, they also shaped her exit from it. In the days and weeks that followed her death, the world mourned. Outside Kensington Palace, thousands of flowers piled up. Millions watched her funeral. And many began to re-examine the way she had been portrayed in the media. Photographs that once seemed harmless now looked calculated. The way she had been positioned next to Charles, the expressions she wore, the glances she avoided, all of it was re-evaluated. People began to ask harder questions about the cost of fame and the pressures of a public life shaped by other people's expectations. And yet, out of all of that, one thing became clear. Diana had managed to use the very system that once restricted her to express something deeper. Through her compassion, her honesty, and her control over how she was seen in her final years, she rewrote the visual legacy she would leave behind. No longer just a princess in someone else's story, she became a symbol of resilience, authenticity, and change. In the years that followed Princess Diana's death, the world did not simply remember her for the tragedy, it began to understand her more fully. The photographs that once shaped her public persona were no longer seen as decorative moments in a royal album. They became historical records, pieces of a larger story about control, perception, and resistance. As journalists, royal experts, and the public revisited these images, it became clear just how tightly Diana's image had been curated to serve the monarchy's narrative. But it was equally clear how she had gradually taken back control and used that same lens to define herself on her own terms. This shift had a lasting impact, not just on the way the public remembered her, but on how the British monarchy has approached public image since. The new generation of royals, Prince William, Prince Harry, and their spouses, have learned from Diana's experiences. They have shown more willingness to engage with the media in ways that feel less staged, more human. Photographs of Prince William and Catherine often show them side by side, at equal height, in natural interactions, without any suggestion of manufactured roles. Likewise, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have spoken openly about the pressures of image control and the toll it took on their well-being. Their decision to step back from royal duties, in part, reflects a rejection of the strict media choreography that defined earlier decades. Diana's influence lives in these choices. She exposed the limits of the royal image machine and challenged the idea that looking perfect was more important than being truthful. She proved that behind every photo was a person, not just a position. And in doing so, she gave permission to future royals and to the public to question what they see and why it's being shown. Today, when we look back at those iconic photographs of Charles and Diana, many of them feel different. The compositions, the body language, the positioning, what once seemed polished, now feels revealing. We see how a marriage was shaped to fit into a picture, rather than the picture reflecting the real marriage. And we understand how those images, though beautiful, often masked something far more complicated beneath the surface. That is the big lie those photos told, not in what they showed, but in what they chose to leave out. With that, we have reached the end of today's show. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.